Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to the COVID-19 Vaccine Facts, Not Fear Vaccine Safety Webinar for Healthcare Providers for December 21st, 2020. My name is Donald Moore, and I'm with the Virginia Department of Health. I'll briefly cover a few administrative announcements before we begin. The discussion format is 45 minutes of moderator-asked questions of the expert panelists and 15 minutes of Q&A from attendees using the chat functionality. Attendees who join by telephone who have questions should send their questions to epnr@vdh.virginia.gov. Your feedback is requested regarding the panel discussion webinars. Please complete the survey. The link is provided in the chat. Your experts panel for the evening is as follows. Dr. Lori Furlano, Deputy Commissioner of Population Health, Virginia Department of Health. Dr. Kosti Sifry, Professor of Medicine and Director of Hospital Epidemiology, UVA Health, Division of Infectious Diseases, Co-Chair, VDH Vaccine Advisory Workgroup, Safety and Efficacy Subgroup. Dr. Michael Stevens, Professor of Internal Medicine and Associate Chair, Division of Infectious Diseases, Associate Hospital Epidemiologist, VCU Health. And your moderator is Dr. Lori Archibald-Pannone, Associate Professor of Medicine, Geriatrics and Infectious Disease, UVA Health. I'll now turn this over to Dr. Archibald-Pannone.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us today. We'll start with an overview on numbers, where we are with COVID infections, specifically long-term care facilities. We'll start with Dr. Furlano. Dr. Furlano, with this forum focused on long-term care facility residents, can you give us a brief overview on where we stand in terms of numbers of COVID-19 infections in long-term care residents in the U.S. and Virginia specifically, and briefly about the impact we've seen from our long-term care facilities and their residents in Virginia?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I've had the privilege of working with a lot of long-term care providers, many of whom are likely on the phone tonight through the long-term care task force that was set up to respond to COVID in Virginia. And without a doubt, the people that live in nursing facilities, other long-term care facilities have definitely seen a disproportionate burden of COVID-19.
I don't know how I can get back to getting this.
I'll just remind participants, if you can mute your line, that's helpful so others can hear. Thanks. So we've seen, unfortunately, with the current surge in Virginia, we're seeing increases in the number of cases of COVID-19 in long-term care facilities. Throughout the pandemic in Virginia, outbreaks in long-term care have accounted for 37% of all outbreaks in Virginia of all different settings. Similarly, the number of so of all the cases that are seen that we know are connected to some kind of outbreak, and this can be in a nursing home or a factory or another kind of setting. Of all of those cases, the number of cases in long-term care account for almost half, so 45%. And then when we look at the deaths that are associated with outbreak cases, the number of deaths, unfortunately, in long-term care facilities represents 94% of all deaths associated with COVID-19 outbreaks specifically. The number of new resident cases that were new cases per week that we're seeing in residents of long-term care or nursing homes specifically has been steadily increasing, and that's very parallel to the surge we're seeing in Virginia as are other parts of the country. The week of Thanksgiving, so that weekend, November 29th, we saw our highest weekly count reported to date. I did not have an opportunity to look at the most recent reports, but there's no reason to think that's getting better, unfortunately. So what we see, and I think is an important thing to hear, is that when transmission of COVID-19 increases in the general community, the virus then has an opportunity to be introduced into these facilities, and the number of long-term care facility outbreaks increases. So early in the pandemic, we were seeing a lot of activity in nursing facilities in northern region when a lot of the disease was up there. Over the summer, we saw more outbreaks in eastern region. Now we really are seeing outbreaks in every region of Virginia. So that's an important take-home message for folks on the call today. The number of cases per outbreak, this will be my last comment. So the number of cases we see per outbreak, it peaked in April and May, then we thankfully saw a dramatic decline. So in May, we saw outbreaks on average of 40 or 50 cases. Now, most outbreaks average somewhere between 25 and 30 cases. Still not where we'd like it to be. That's remained a pretty steady number. So there's definitely room for improvement there, and we're grateful that vaccine is on the horizon. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those numbers with us to really understand some of the impact that we've seen in long-term care. Speaking specifically about the vaccine, can you discuss why long-term care facility residents and staff are the top priority for getting the vaccine first, and what other groups are considered in this top priority?
That's a great question. And as many folks probably know, Virginia adopted the CDC's ACIP priority recommendations for the first phase of vaccine. We call that phase 1A. And so healthcare workers and long-term care residents were designated as two top priority groups of equal importance. And the reason for that is that we think about science, we think about the evidence for vaccines, and we want to make sure that it's effective in the populations that we're targeting. We also do have to think about feasibility and practicality. Can we reach the population that we need to reach in an operation of this magnitude? And we also think about ethics, very importantly, and equity. And all of these three principles that CDC puts forth are important, and they're all addressed when you look at the long-term facility population. The vaccine is effective in this population. We are fortunate to have a federal partnership, a pharmacy partnership that will be serving these long-term care facility residents. So we have an effective and efficient means to reach residents of long-term care facilities, and these ethical principles. So we want to reach those most vulnerable. This is a way to reduce morbidity, death, or mortality, death, and morbidity, which is severe illness in this population that's been disproportionately impacted. So I think all of those things really support the decision to prioritize these residents for the vaccine.
Thank you. Dr. Stevens, can you help us understand a little bit more about these vaccines? Specifically, can you tell us how mRNA vaccines work?
Thank you for the question. I'll try to keep it, my comments relatively brief. So, most vaccines utilize either a whole, live, attenuated, or beat down virus that can't cause disease, or components of viruses. And the production of vaccines is labor intensive, takes a long time, and is relatively costly. What the mRNA technology allows us to do is to take the code for a protein, a viral protein, and allows our own cells to manufacture the protein using that code. And the advantage to this is you can mass produce these relatively quickly, relatively cheaply. It's important to note that this mRNA technology, these mRNA strands break down quickly. They don't incorporate into DNA. So really, we're avoiding utilizing any type of sort of virus or viral components. Some of the things to note about it, and I know people have heard about this, maintaining that cold chain is super important with the two vaccines, the Mrna and the Pfizer vaccines that have come out. And so people have heard about the refrigeration and all that kind of stuff. That's not really atypical for many vaccines. They have to follow a very close cold chain process, of which we have a lot of experience with in the United States. And so that's the mRNA vaccines in a nutshell.
Thank you. And you mentioned the two mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and the Mrna. Are those two vaccines interchangeable Meaning if I get the first dose with one of those vaccines, do I have to get the second dose with the same one?
So another important question for sure. The short answer is no, mainly because they weren't studied that way. And so we want to make sure people get the best bang for their buck in terms of the effectiveness of the vaccine. And really, you should complete the series with the vaccine that you started the series with.
Great. So if the first dose is from Pfizer, then the second dose also has to be from Pfizer, for example.
Correct.
Thank you for clarifying. And can you briefly clarify some key differences between the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine for us?
Yeah, so again, to keep things relatively, straightforward, and I can sort of go into detail, they are both mRNA vaccines, as we discussed, and they both have similar safety and effectiveness data. And so essentially, when people are thinking about these things, my dad had a question about this today. He's like, well, which one do I want? I said, you want the one you can get in your hand or in your arm, as it were, because they're essentially they're essentially equivalent. So they're very safe. They're wildly, more effective than I think anybody anticipated. Some subtle differences. So the Pfizer is approved or has the emergency use authorization for people who are 16 years of age and above versus the Mrna, which is 18 years of age and above. The Mrna, you get at day 0, day 28. Pfizer, you get at day 0, day 21. And, you can sort of, really go down the rabbit hole in terms of, which one is, most effective. Essentially, they're both around 95% effective. And so really what I'm telling people is get the one you can get, period.
Great. So practically speaking, for our population, they're equal, but you have to stick with the one that you get first. And the main difference being when that second dose comes. For the Pfizer at 21 days, for the Moderna at 28 days, correct?
Correct.
Wonderful. And in terms of safety, and you mentioned the emergency use authorization a little bit, we've been in the depths of this COVID pandemic for what seems like forever. On the other hand, people are voicing concerns about the speed of the FDA approval process. Dr. Sifry, if we could you tell us about the vaccine trials, how many people were studied in these trials, and a little bit more on the efficacy data?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So good evening, everybody. So these trials, and we can talk a little bit about the whole EUA authorization part a little bit later, but so these are, in terms of clinical trials, the trials for both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine are every bit as large as we've seen for other vaccines that have been brought to market recently. So the Pfizer vaccine has a total of 43,000, actually more than 43,000 enrollees that were in the safety trial. The efficacy was a little bit of a smaller population. And the Mrna was around 30,000. And by comparison, if I remember, Shingrix was on the order of 18,000 or thereabouts. I may not have that number quite right. So these are large clinical trials that are well performed, placebo-controlled, blinded studies that have been performed in the typical fashion for other vaccines and other therapeutics. And importantly, both trials and also the ones that are in the pipeline have endeavored very significantly to try to reflect the population for the most part of people who are at risk for COVID. So that includes a substantial number of people that are elderly. And I guess the one thing that is sort of missing, probably not relevant for this conversation usually, is children, because that's going to be a large second group that'll be coming later, and clinical trials are starting for those. In terms of efficacy, I think you heard a little bit from Mike a little bit earlier, and Lori as well, that these are incredibly effective vaccines. And importantly, because we have a substantial number of people that were aged greater than 75 or greater than 65 in these clinical trials, if I remember right, they both were above 20% in the persons age 65 or older, and then a smaller portion of people that were older than 75. On the order of less than 5%, they still were incredibly effective. And that's, again, to have a vaccine that both of these vaccines are about 95% protective for in general. And those numbers held up for people who are older. Truthfully, I think many of us going into this were anticipating we may see a flu-like phenomenon where some level of immune senescence may manifest, where the vaccine would not be as effective in this population of individuals that are highly at risk for infection. So great news. In terms of side effect profile, very similar to the general population. Actually, even better news for the most part. Reactogenicity is pretty significant with the second doses of both of these vaccines. So 75, 85% people will have local arm pain and discomfort, and then maybe some more systemic symptoms. In general, those are much reduced, or those are reasonably reduced in older individuals compared to younger individuals.
Great, thank you. And can you tell us a little bit more about the FDA emergency use authorization, the EUA that we hear so much about? What makes that process any different than the usual process of authorization for vaccinations?
Yeah, so a usual process is a licensure process, and it's one that I think we're all familiar with, where you have preclinical studies that lead to phase 1, and then phase 2, and then phase 3 clinical trials, often with stopping points in between as companies decide on what next steps are early on when grants are obtained and there's decisions. And so that is why most vaccines take 4 or 5 longer, even longer for to come to fruition. In terms of what the EUA process has been, and I actually sort of want to talk about this a little bit more in general, how these vaccines have come to receive this authorization with a year after discovery of the virus. It gets a little bit back to what Mike had sort of started the conversation with. So on January 10th, which was 11 days after the first announcement of that there was this novel coronavirus in Wuhan, the genome was published on GenBank. 66 days after that, because of the platform, this mRNA platform that had been developed and studied for several decades before that, they were able to start phase 1 clinical trials using this technology. So we went from understanding what the genome was into these plug-and-play platforms. Also, what we're going to be seeing later on are adenovirus-based vectors and protein subunit-based products. To move those into clinical trials quickly. So that was, first of all, based on a lot of experience. And then importantly, Operation Warp Shield, not my favorite name, but Operation Warp Shield then helped develop a pathway for not shortcutting the science, but importantly, sort of reducing the time between the steps of this phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trial. So they were able to, once receive the necessary phase 1 safety data, were then able to move into these large clinical trials, and concurrent with that, ramp up production of the vaccine. So, and also able to do that under the large umbrella of Operation Warp Shield. The big difference, so once, after submission of the request for authorization from the FDA and then review by the CDC's Acip, ACIP guideline, the big difference between the standard process and what was this EUA authorization is really the duration of follow-up. The average duration follow-up for these patients who were enrolled in the studies are 2 months, whereas usually it'd be much longer, on the order of a year for a standard vaccine. And actually that process is still going to occur. So these are authorized, they're time limited. We're going to continue, globally, these companies are going to continue to follow the evaluation of the safety of these vaccines and answer some important questions like how long does the efficacy last from these clinical trials, and then they'll submit that later as part of a formal licensure process.
Thank you for explaining that process and really how it started basically January the 10th and has been rolling ever since. Thank you for that. Dr. Stevens, if we could turn to you next, thinking specifically about our long-term care facility staff. What do we know about how safe the COVID-19 vaccine is in pregnancy or for nursing mothers?
Yeah, so we don't know the answer to that question yet. I mean, it's really the bottom line. The safety has not been established in pregnant or breastfeeding women. We're going to have some more data on that, I think, in the future for sure. But right now, we don't know the hard answer to that question. Now, knowing what we know about the mRNA technology, we don't anticipate in either of these populations it would be an issue, but that's not hard data. I think this is an important question, and many or several national organizations have come out and sort of weighed in on this. Because I think for context, as everybody knows on this call, COVID can be a really bad disease, and people who are pregnant are at higher risk for complications of COVID, including fetal loss, preterm birth, and then having more severe COVID, right? And so we have to balance these things. I think on December 13th, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists came out and said, don't withhold the vaccines from pregnant women or breastfeeding women who are in the priority groups as designated by the ACIP. It's already been mentioned multiple times. And so I think many healthcare providers who are in one of those first tiers that are being vaccinated, who are pregnant, are getting the vaccine, understanding that risk of the disease likely outweighs the potential theoretical, but probably low risk from the vaccines themselves.
Thank you for that. And to follow up a little bit, is there any medical condition that would preclude someone from safely getting the COVID-19 vaccination?
The answer to that is no, with the precaution that, you know, there's been a handful of cases with the Pfizer vaccine of what I call anaphylactoid-like reactions. So people who have almost like an anaphylaxis type, reaction, really, again, just a handful of cases, but there's a precaution that if somebody has a history of severe allergy to any vaccine or any injectable, that you watch that person carefully for 30 minutes after they receive the vaccine. Running our travel clinic at VCU, this is super common, to encounter, and people generally do fine. You just have to plan ahead and be ready to, administer appropriate medications and support if somebody were to have an anaphylaxis type reaction.
Thank you. And Dr. Sifry, what types of side effects are likely to occur from the vaccine, and what are your thoughts also on the allergic reactions that we've been hearing about?
Yeah, so the most common side effects are mild. They're not anything different than you would expect for most vaccines. So especially with the first dose, what you're going to anticipate is local pain and discomfort, and that's what I'd counsel your patients with. Particularly then after the second dose, you may have some systemic symptoms, things like fatigue, headache, myalgias, low-grade temperatures. So we haven't gone through our 2 doses of vaccines yet, but that's what was been reported in both of the clinical trials for the Pfizer and the Mrna, on the order of 10% or so. We have and are working to counsel, and when we're thinking about this for an occupational health standpoint, to stagger the dosing across units so that not everybody receives a vaccine at the same time. I can anticipate that may be a little bit more of a challenge in long-term care if CVS or Walgreens is going to provide all the vaccine on the same day. However, it is also notable, again, that for older individuals, those side effects tend to be a little bit less likely. There are a set of less likely side effects or observations that have occurred in the clinical trials. One has been adenopathy in both of the trials, appears to be a little bit more frequent. Typically in the ipsilateral arm where the vaccine has been administered, and I think probably a pretty good sign of vaccine take, so to speak. And there has been this much discussed observation of a numerical increase in Bell's palsy. There were 4 cases of Bell's palsy in the Pfizer vaccine with none in the placebo group. And in the Pfizer vaccine, there were 3 cases of Bell's palsy compared to 1 in the placebo group. What to make of that is not entirely clear. The FDA guidance and the CDC recommendations are that this does not appear that much more elevated than what you'd see in the general population. This is covered in VAERS. It's part of the standard, I think, observations that occur after vaccination. So we'll probably gain more information of this afterwards. And there is not a precaution for people who have a history of Bell's palsy for these vaccines. think the final point that you brought up again, and Mike talked about it, was I think the much publicized discussions around anaphylaxis or severe reaction after vaccination that occurred after the vaccine was rolled out in large extents in the UK, and there have been a couple cases in the United States and Alaska. And again, very similar to what Mike has said, what is a contraindication for a COVID vaccine is a known anaphylactic reaction to a component of the vaccine. So in the rare circumstance, I think it's not going to be likely if it's even occurred. If somebody's had another mRNA vaccine as part of a clinical trial and they've had an anaphylactic reaction, that would certainly be, I think, we could anticipate to be a contraindication for this type of vaccine. If they had components and these components are unique, these lipids, I'm not anticipating that would be a known adverse event, adverse reaction. One of the components of what I've heard about a little bit has been PEG, polyethylene glycol. There is a conjugate of one of the lipids that carries that in. I'm not a allergist, but if somebody had that type of a contraindication, that'd be a person that I may refer to an allergist to try immunologist to try to sort that out if somebody hadn't reported history of a Miralax allergy, for example, which I've never seen in my life. So that's really the contraindication. The precautions, again, as Mike said, if somebody has had a history of a anaphylactic reaction or other severe allergic reaction to an injectable vaccine or other injectable medication, then that is a precaution. It is, again, I think probably, again, a conversation some people will maybe want to have with their allergist. But is also, I think, again, risk-benefit discussion in terms of what is the potential side effects of having a novel reaction to a vaccine versus what is the risk for COVID and understanding your epidemiology.
Okay, great. Thank you both. And so what I'm hearing is, in terms of the long-term care population specifically, there would be no special post-vaccine precautions to take, but perhaps for some with potential for allergies, maybe a 30-minute observation period after.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lori. I forgot to mention that. So for people who have that history of a severe reaction to another injectable, then I think observation, the recommendation is a 30-minute observation after vaccination.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Fulano, if we could turn to you. Once a resident or staff member gets the COVID-19 vaccination, what type of monitoring or follow-up will be done?
So in addition to just the routine follow-up that occurs, what Dr. Sifry just described, just immediately upon vaccination, a few things I'll say is CDC provides some general guidance to us on what are called post-vaccine considerations for residents of long-term care. So I think we've already talked about some of the potential systemic post-vaccination signs and symptoms, which at least to date are known to be mild to moderate in severity, typically occur within the first 3 days of vaccination, typically resolve within a couple of days, and may be more frequent or severe following the second dose, but that's so far been more likely in younger persons. So just advising the clinicians to watch for those things. Other symptoms like cough, shortness of breath, sore throat, loss of taste and smell, those are not consistent with post-vaccination and instead may be symptoms of SARS-CoV-2 infection or some other kind of infection, so should be considered clinically. And the other thing I'll note that the standard monitoring and safety systems that are in place for all kinds of vaccines remain in place for COVID-19 as well. So our vaccines, the federal systems for safety monitoring, vaccine adverse event reporting system, or VAERS. There's also a couple of other tools that the federal government has put in place for COVID-19. One tool is called vSafe, which is a phone app that individuals who've been vaccinated can enter information into this app. And so that's another way for CDC to collect information on this specific vaccines.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Fulano, again, once a resident or staff member gets the COVID-19 vaccination, what types of changes should happen regarding isolation or infection control or PPE use?
Sure. That's a really good question, particularly for the providers on the line. So in short, I think the data is still, there's a lot of unknowns still. So we don't know everything we'd like to know about the vaccine effectiveness in the general population. We'd like to learn more about its ability to reduce not only reduction in disease severity, but also transmission. We're still learning more about the duration of protection. So for now, we're CDC and VH are advising that residents and healthcare personnel should continue to follow all of the current infection prevention and control recommendations that are in place right now. And none of that has changed in regard to their vaccination status, at least not now. But we'll continue to keep folks apprised as things evolve over time. Also, when making decisions about when or when not to exclude workers from work or where to place long-term care residents, all of those things really need the current precautions should remain in play for now.
Thank you for clarifying that. And Dr. Sifry, thinking about our long-term facility residents, just a little bit more about safety. What do we know about the safety of the vaccine in elderly people, and especially those with multiple comorbidities specifically?
Yeah, so very good question, a very common question. So what has been seen is this, these vaccines are very well tolerated, they're very safe, and again, less reactogenic in persons typically who are older. So very, very, very well tolerated. And that's also true of people that have comorbidities. So this is, I think, good news that people who need the vaccine the most, the elderly people with comorbidities, it's very safe. And again, subgroup analysis for both these trials suggests very efficacious.
Thank you. And Dr. Sifry, again, and a question that's also popped up on the chat already. If someone has had COVID-19 infection, should they get vaccinated?
So the short answer is yes. So we know repeat infection within 90 days is not particularly common, but it's also not impossible. And we also need to acknowledge it's sometimes difficult to understand because people can be PCR positive for a long period of time after vaccination. I think this really becomes important in long-term care, where there's ping-ponging of infections within a long-term care facility. So yes, it is. And finally, I should add that some of the data from the Pfizer study have suggested that there is efficacy. There's efficacy in people that have had infection in the past with COVID for protecting them from repeat infection. So the long and the short answer is yes, you can be vaccinated after you have, even though you've had infection in the past, even if you had infection in the past and may be predicted to be less likely to have disease, it still appears to be efficacious. And it's certainly not a contraindication. There's certainly been no signal, and this was a matter of some study as to whether there was any suggestion of disease enhancement, there was any side effect profile that occurred in people that had previous COVID infection when they got the vaccine.
Thank you for that. Now that we've discussed kind of the why and the how that the vaccine works in these groups of people, let's transition to discuss kind of how can we make this happen. So Dr. Fulano, for you, in long-term care facilities in Virginia, how will we get the vaccine to residents and staff, and who will administer the vaccine?
So VDH, along with many other states, we officially activated what's a federal partnership. So it's a CDC pharmacy long-term care partnership for just this purpose, for vaccinating the staff and residents of long-term care facilities. We activated that with the federal government in early December, the first week of December, and the first vaccinations will start to go into arms of long-term care facility residents and staff next week, the week beginning December 28th. The majority of facilities in Virginia will receive vaccination from one of two pharmacies, CVS or Walgreens, via that partnership. And it's a really nice program because it will help us ensure some degree of equity across the state as far as access to the vaccine, because they have a large reach geographically, and the vast majority of facilities will be matched with one of these pharmacies. I do want to note that skilled nursing facilities are prioritized first within the long-term care umbrella, followed by assisted living facility clinics. It will take likely several weeks to get through those skilled nursing facilities, and we'll update that timeline as more information becomes available, because we're operating on what we know right now today. And if there's any changes in allocation or anything like that in the future, that might impact the timeline. Those pharmacies are continuing to develop their implementation plan. We're in regular communication. Our vaccine team communicates with both pharmacies weekly. So they're very, very collaborative and really wanting feedback. And we've had some really helpful feedback from some long-term care clinicians that we've shared with the pharmacies so they can adjust their operations accordingly. They've started to reach out already to long-term care facilities to start scheduling the first clinic. So that's really exciting news. And as I said, that will continue to occur over the next few weeks. And so I think that's it in a nutshell. And this will really evolve over time. And we're looking forward to the program getting started next week.
Great. And to talk a little bit, Dr. Fulano, about cost, will there be a cost for the vaccine to residents or staff members getting vaccinated? Is there a copay?
That's a great question. No, there is no out-of-pocket expense to residents or staff. The pharmacies that are involved in this partnership, they can bill an insurance company for the cost of administering the vaccine, but they cannot bill the cost to a resident or the staff member being vaccinated. So they will be collecting insurance information, but if that's not available, that's not a reason for anyone to be turned away. There's also another federal fund set up for those persons who don't have insurance or maybe underinsured, and the pharmacy can bill to the federal fund that is set up for that specific purpose. So no cost to the residents or the staff.
And what about the facility? Is there a cost to the facility for the vaccination?
Thanks. No, there will not be a cost to the facility.
Great, thank you. All right, and as we're wrapping up a bit, Dr. Stevens, in the final part of this discussion, can you share some of your thoughts on vaccine hesitancy, fears, and concerns people might have about getting this vaccine? Specifically thinking about vaccine hesitancy, perhaps among long-term care facility residents, their families, or among the staff.
Yeah, so that's another critical question. I think it's important we all recognize that we are dealing with a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of mistrust. And I think one of the most important things that providers can do is, number one, directly talk with people who are hesitant to receive the vaccine, have an open dialogue, and really try to understand where someone is coming from, and be fully transparent about what we don't know. I mean, I think we have to lead with that and say, these are the things we don't know. That's your entry, to get to the things that we do know, and really having a discussion about the risks and the benefits. The thing I think we need to avoid doing is not discussing, the uncertainties and the things we don't know. Again, wherever possible, having a frontline provider discuss directly with that resident or their family member about what their concerns are, that's going to end up being, the most sort of productive thing that we can do. And I'll also mention in the chat, Dr. Klein shared, I think, some CDC, communications information, which is also, helpful. So there's lots of good stuff out there now to help, answer this very question.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, that concludes our formal panel discussion about vaccines in our long-term care community. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Klein for additional questions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Archibald Pannone, Dr. Forlano, Dr. Sifri, and Dr. Stevens. We very, very much appreciate your time, and we very much appreciate the presence of all the participants. We're very glad that you're here. I'm going to go through all of the questions we can get through in the chat, and this is going to be the COVID Q&A version of speed dating. So let's try to cover them. And this one is particularly relevant to Dr. Stevens, who specializes also in travel medicine. After the vaccine, how do they test for COVID-19? And what happens if someone needs a negative test to travel? What are your thoughts on that?
Speed dating style. All right. So a test for infection would involve a PCR test, which will be unaffected by vaccination.
Perfect. Excellent. Another excellent question. Is the vaccine safe in immunocompromised people? Dr. Sifri.
Speed dating with a date you don't want, I think, right? The data suggests that it's safe in immunocompromised patients in as much as that they had patients with stable HIV in the clinical trials. And again, across classes, it's showed broad safety. The open question I think that we hear about is efficacy, and that is not that's not known right now. So that I think shouldn't dissuade us from thinking about vaccinating patients who are immunocompromised. But to Mike's earlier discussion about openness and transparency, this is remains an open question that hopefully we'll be able to answer soon.
Thank you. Dr. Forlano, this is a question about whether long-term care facilities with pharmacies will be able to administer the vaccine. I think you've covered that. It will be CVS and Walgreens.
I think the vast majority of facilities will be served by CVS or Walgreens, and those pharmacies will be administering the vaccine. I'm just going to get a nod from Stephanie. Is that right? Yeah, thanks.
And just to be clear, that they will be vaccinating residents and staff.
Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's possible that a staff member could obtain a vaccine elsewhere. Sometimes they are employed in multiple places, might work for a hospital or something like that. So it's possible that they may have an opportunity to be vaccinated elsewhere, and that's fine.
If I can add one comment, sorry. This is Stephanie Wewell with the vaccination unit. And the comment that I would add is that these pharmacies, Walgreens and CVS, are set up as really temporary vaccination sources. So they're going to come in 3 times for these vaccinations. So it still behooves long-term care facility pharmacies to go ahead and get set up and fill out the provider intent, because there's going to be a natural need to continue immunizing or vaccinating staff and residents as there's turnover.
Mm-hmm.
They work this plan with our short long-term plan.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Great. Another question that was posed was about the differences between first and second dose. Dr. Stevens?
Yeah, so the dose is the same. And I think that the biggest thing that people are probably wondering is, why is the side effect profile enhanced after the second dose? Because your immune system is primed. And now, it already has seen this thing before, and now it can make a more robust response. So in a nutshell, that's why there's the higher subset of folks that get the fever, more systemic symptoms, that kind of stuff. It's very similar if people have administered Shingrix in the past. This is the same thing that happens to people who get Shingrix.
Excellent. This is there's a question, since we do have time, there has been publicity about the new strains of the virus that are appearing in the UK. And I think it's really important that we address what we know. So Dr. Sifry and Dr. Stevens, if you want to weigh in.
Yeah. Actually, just getting back to what we know and what we don't know, this is another good example, an evolving epidemic that we're learning as we go. And this is rapidly evolving over the course of less than a week. Probably really the news stands on Friday. So what we know about this new variant, it has a couple different names. The one that I think that is being settled on is something called Variant Under Investigation 2020-12-1. So I think this is going to become a common nomenclature. What we know about this variant is that during a period of time when other variants, when other versions of COVID-19, of SARS-CoV-2 were being, investigated in the UK, there became a predominant strain initially in Kent and outside of London. And it first showed up in September, and then since then has now sort of grown in terms of its frequency, so that in those parts of southern England, south and eastern England, it now accounts for somewhere between 10 to 30% of all strains of COVID. Now, this has been seen before. There's the famous European strain of COVID that you may remember from early summer or maybe even late spring that emerged. It was different than the Asian version, and it was shown in vitro and in animal studies to be more transmissible. And that's thought to be part of the reason that it became a successful strain of COVID, that it was more transmissible. And this sounds like it may be a very similar situation with this strain, that it's about 70% or so from what preliminary results suggest from an epidemiologic perspective to be more transmissible, again, in southern England. And it's been noted at least in 4 other countries. We don't know about the United States, or at least I haven't heard about that, but I think we've heard about that it's been found in some other strain banks. Now, what does that mean? From what I understand, there's no suggestion right now that it's more virulent, but it is more transmissible. Again, what we've seen in the past. It does have about 23 or 24 different mutations, a couple small deletions, and then at least 17 or so that encode new amino acids, including one that occurs in the spike protein, which is the target for the COVID vaccine. And that raises the question, is the COVID vaccines that are now being deployed, are they going to be protective against this variant of COVID? And again, in transparency, I think the short answer to that is we don't know. And I think that if you have conversations with your family, with your patients, and thinking about that, I think that's the honest answer. But the second thing to bring up is that the mRNAs that are being encoded, that are part of these vaccines, encode whole proteins that are locked into a conformational stage that allows it to dock onto the receptor that where it's taken up onto the into the cell. So there's going to be a lot of antigenic epitopes in there. So the experts are suggesting that the likelihood that it's going to lead to a reduced efficacy vaccine are low. But again, in honesty, this is going to be something that we're going to be watching in the days, weeks, and months to come.
I will also ask, since we do have a minute here, what else is in the pipeline? Any thoughts, Dr. Stevens, for vaccines that are coming to us that have not yet been approved?
I think at last count, and someone can correct me, there may be, I think, 40 candidates at various stages in the pipeline. If people haven't seen the Infectious Disease Society of America, with a grant from the CDC, put together a beautiful website that's focused on healthcare practitioners called the Real-Time Learning Network. So I can put it in the chat, but people may want to look at that, Google it. It's a clearinghouse of guidelines, but also has high-level summaries of things like exactly what we're talking about here, what's in the pipeline. And so there's a number of promising candidates. None of them are, obviously as close as the ones that already have emergency use authorization. And they use different platforms, not the mRNA platform. And so there's going to be more. We'll hear more I think, in the next 2 to 3 months about other vaccines, and that will help, as we try to extend vaccination to the, general population. There's been some setbacks with some of the other platforms, but success, I think, is on the horizon, at least in the next couple months. We'll hear more positive news, I think.
Dr. Sifri, you had a comment?
Yeah, so I was going to just let you know that is I agree with Mike. That's a great website. And if you're looking for something that's easy to digest on your cell phone, the New York Times also has a pretty digestible vaccine development website. Our vaccine efficacy and safety subgroup been looking specifically at the vaccines that are currently in phase 3 clinical trials right now. We have interim data for the AstraZeneca adenovirus-based vaccine. The adenovirus-based vaccines are interesting because that's what was used by Merck, I believe, to develop the Ebola vaccine that's been highly effective. And it was really important, an important step forward after our West Africa Ebola outbreak, and then it was tested later on in the decade. So there's another vaccine platform that has a similar approach, and that's Johnson & Johnson, which is attractive because it's a single dose vaccine. And so I think everybody's waiting to hear interim analysis. And then finally, there's some protein vaccines that are in the works as well that are exciting and are not dissimilar to what's been used, for example, for hepatitis B vaccination. So I think those are the ones on the immediate horizon that we can anticipate to hear results of in the next couple of months.
Okay, thank you so much. So there is clearly a light at the end of the tunnel. Dr. Forlano, there have been a couple of questions that referable to those who are underserved and how Virginia is making sure that vaccine is being distributed equitably and based on equity and addressing the disparities in equity and in race?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I think I'll start with this population specifically, or I guess the two, long-term care residents and the long-term care staff. So long-term care residents, I think the pharmacy partnership is definitely something I think the federal government, but Virginia thought about as far as our ability to achieve some level of equitable access. So because those pharmacies have such broad reach, we feel pretty confident that at least initially they'll be able to reach most facilities, enabling equitable access to long-term care residents and staff. Moving forward, we'll work with the facilities thereafter. As far as workers are concerned, and long-term care workers are no exception, at least nationally. First, this fun fact, the vast majority of long-term care facility workers are women. Many of them are persons of color. National data shows the same thing for Virginia. And then essential workers, broadly defined, in general, racial and ethnic minority groups are disproportionately represented in many of those occupations. So I think by prioritizing long-term care staff, as other essential workers, we are at least helping to mitigate those known health inequities by reaching those populations first. That was the thought of ACIP, I think, when they put forth long-term care facility residents and staff first, and in their more recently published guidance, which is recommending essential workers as part of a priority group. Virginia is still contemplating those more recently published guidelines, and we'll hopefully be able to work those recommendations through our vaccine advisory work group and our Virginia Disaster Medical Advisory Committee, and we'll be able to share information with the public shortly on that. But equity is definitely at the forefront of our decision making in Virginia.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And there was also a question about hesitancy and overcoming resistance, coming back to that topic, particularly among members of underserved populations who might have a history of distrust. And I throw that out to the whole panel. Any thoughts on that in particular?
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to start. But I'll provide the caveat that I am not a clinician that provides direct care anymore. In addition to what Dr. Stevens mentioned earlier, I think being very honest and acknowledging the reasons why many racial minorities have distrust is very important, and understanding the history behind that, understanding why that does not help build trust, and what we can do to listen. So that those are the first things that come to mind for me, but I would definitely look to the clinicians on the panel to speak to that too.
I can go next, and then Mike can finish up if he wants. But one I think very important thing is to try to find the right messenger, the person that's able to connect with the populations to provide that message. So I would endeavor, suggest that you endeavor now to try to find who those voices are, to provide them the information that they need to help provide that message. And that can be within our medical communities. There are leaders in our medical communities, particularly people who are of a social group like that has an ethnic or racial background that has had where there have been barriers to vaccination. So I think it's important to find those, but also in the community. Since I don't know long-term care as well, but I think that's probably going to be a very similar conversation even within long-term care. The final part, I think, is that I think many of you on the call are going to be the recognized and trusted primary care clinicians for those patients who can have those types of critical conversations. So I think it's both a personal discussion and then trying to find, more broadly, those people that can provide the messages and have that trust and understanding of those communities.
Yeah, I'll just also note that the National Medical Association put out a statement today from their vaccine and vaccine advisory task force reviewing the data specifically, and has a wonderful resource online available as well as an organization. So that's another thing I can put in the chat.
I would like to offer, there is a woman by the name of Heidi Larson, who is the head of the Vaccine Confidence Project in Britain and is an expert on overcoming hesitancy. And she has said over and over again, inform, encourage, and support. Do not proselytize, do not preach. Our telling patients and staff and anyone that something is safe does not make it so for them. We need to allow them to voice their concerns, hear their concerns. There are a lot of rumors and myths that are now out there. You can address them, but only if you know what they are. So, it's giving patients and staff room to be honest about what they're frightened about. I have found most people are easily convinced when you do allow them to voice their concerns and not feel bullied or dismissed. So any other questions? We have finished up 2 minutes early. I thank everyone for participating. I thank the panelists, all of you for taking the time to do this and educating all the providers. Thank you so. Donald Moore, we have we request, Donald has reminded me, we have a survey. We would really appreciate your feedback as we move forward in developing more panels. Here is the link to the survey. So if you have time, please do that. And again, I thank you.
Thank you all. It's a great discussion.
Thanks, Dr. Archibald Pannone. Appreciate your moderating. Bye, everybody.
All right. Take care. Good night. Thank you.
And we put the survey, there's the survey link. Brian, it's right there. It's in the chat and on the slide.
Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.